Have my friend, my buddy, Todd Kane. Todd, welcome. Thanks for joining us, man.
Awesome to be here. Thanks for having me.
So when I was thinking about what topics are interesting to MSPs, I made this whole long list of things, and one of them was actually ChatGPT helped me with this because, like, hey, give me 50 topics that MSPs might be interested in improving their operational efficiency, and one of them was service desk, and one of them was project management. And I thought, geez, Todd has spent the last few years literally in the thick of this with your consulting firm, coaching MSPs, running the course that you run. And so, anyways, I'm probably butchering some of the experience, but tell us a little bit about your projects there, Todd.
Yeah, so I'm originally a tech, come to this from the technical side of the world, and then had my first consulting company before I graduated high school. So very early on, and then rolled up into this company mentioned here, Longview Systems, where I went on this crazy ride where we went through this explosive growth phase. Yeah, I grew up in Calgary, and oil was $200 a barrel, and VMware was a brand new thing. So we went on a rocket ship ride and grew at this crazy pace where we were hiring 20 to 30 people a week for months at a time. And we had to figure out how to scale a leadership team really fast and really efficiently. So that was my crash course MBA on moving from technical to operations into the management side of the world. So took that experience and did a couple of turnarounds for Bell Canada. Met my great friend Luis and ended up at Fully Managed, where I went for another amazing ride and building Fully Managed. And we tripled revenue, doubled headcount, increased gross margin by double digits. And then I kind of reflected on the experience that I'd had through all of this and going through a lot of these events, and recognized all the things that I understood to be just good business sense and good ways to run an IT service company were not common knowledge to a lot of people out there, and recognized a lot of people didn't have these experiences to draw upon. So went back to my consulting roots instead of working inside businesses as an entrepreneur. Started my own consulting group to give that back to the community and help others kind of adapt those systems and figure out where are you, where do you want to be, and what's the plan to get you there, essentially.
That's awesome. Well, and in the process of doing that, you also started a podcast, and I think you just had your 100th episode, if I'm not mistaken,
Yeah,
or
yeah,
close
just
to
past
that.
100. Mm-hmm.
So congrats on that. Todd's podcast also interviews, interesting folks on various topics. One of the recent ones was actually, I didn't realize you had wanted to start a Mac consultancy, and I found out when I was listening to your episode with Lucas from Fuji, out in Atlanta. Luke is a guy who I've known for years through the Apple consulting space and such. So that's cool, man. Awesome. Thank you for coming here. Let's just jump right in because I think there's just so many things that are happening. And I'd love to maybe give every question a couple of angles. You've seen
Yep.
it from the large MSP perspective and how things work when you have a little bit of scale, when you have a little bit of, hierarchy and teams and capabilities. But you've probably also seen it from the complete opposite side of the spectrum with smaller shops, the 3, 5, 7, 10-person shops, and what kind of, let's just say, replacements of capacity that they have to make some of these things work. So I think KPIs is an interesting one to start with, simply because we've just been having this conversation over the last couple of interviews. It seems like a lot of people love vanity metrics, and not all of them have, effective decision-making power. And so tell us a little bit about what you think of some of the key KPIs that are helping to really improve service desk efficiency.
Okay, so just you triggered a couple of thoughts for me around vanity metrics. I think my sort of love and hate relationship on revenue as a number that you measure. Revenue is a measure of maybe the size of your business, but not the efficiency of your business. In a lot of ways, it is a vanity number. And I really encourage people to start focusing more on profit. It's kind of amazing to me the number of times that I meet with an owner of an organization, and off the top of their head, they know how much revenue they have, of course, but they often don't know how much profit they're making. And that's a really important number that you want to learn early and be able to measure and affect. So on a broad level, revenue is interesting and a nice number to have, but you really want to focus more on the bottom line for sure. The other part of this is I am a dashboard nut. Like you'll remember this, Luis, and Fully Managed. We had dashboards all over the wall, hanging from the ceiling, and this was like my sort of my sweet space. I loved this. In a lot of ways, because I'm a very logical person. I like to understand things and be able to validate things with data. And what I find data is really helpful for, in fact, I just did a video for this morning around insights versus information. And what KPIs can be really valuable for is marrying a subjective experience with an objective measure. And there are so many things that we go about in our business and trying to understand of what's going on. We have a sense or a feeling of things that might or might not be happening in the business, but we often lack the objective data to actually measure that and affect it. And that's where KPIs, I think, are really, really powerful, is like I mentioned earlier, is understanding where are we and where do we want to be, what's possible, and therefore what are the things that we should start doing to influence those KPIs. So that's how it's really, really powerful, as just understanding where are we and where do we want to get to. That's super, super powerful. So I'll run. Yeah, go
you're
ahead.
blowing my mind already, because subjective, I think MSPs are all about the subjective feelings.
Oh
Oh,
yeah,
it feels really busy this week, or
exactly.
it feels like this customer is really noisy. But go and try and figure out exactly what backs up that claim, and sometimes it's really difficult to find. So, what are some examples of some of those subjective feelings with or the objective measures that you have found are interesting to sort of try and implement?
Yeah, so I have this whole rant that I go on all the time. I'll reserve myself right now. So
Come on,
hashtag
man.
ban
No, just hit it. Just go into the
hash
rant.
hashtag ban busy. Busy is such a crutch in our industry, right? Like, it's IT. It will always be busy. Don't tell me you're busy. And I have to encourage owners and managers to try and experiment to try and ban the word busy in your business. Like, people, like, you go talk to someone, you're doing a one-on-one, you're dropping by someone's desk, and if you catch them saying busy, say like, nah, like, hang on, what are you working on? Like, busy doesn't cut it, right? So there's a Henry
Yeah.
Thoreau quote, answer busy. What are you busy with? Right. So it's just such an excuse. Like, busy is often a masking of prioritization. Like, if you can't figure out what you're busy with, there's not a qualification around the actual value you're producing and the time you're spending.
Mm.
Okay. So there's a much longer version of this, but we only have so much time, Luis.
Yeah, I
Uh,
saw a good
uh,
TikTok this week. I always claim TikTok's my favorite educational medium. And it was some lady saying, the people that are constantly saying how busy they are usually the ones that aren't getting any shit done at all. And everybody laughed, because it's kind of like hashtag true. But I hear that, and I think it is a crutch, and I think it's also just habitual that we say that. Oh man, it's so
exactly.
busy. But it's also not negative necessarily. It's like, hey, it's great to be busy. There's worse problems to have, I guess, than not having
Yep.
enough projects or not having enough work. But I get what you're saying.
Yeah. I'll
Um,
often ask people, is it the good busy or the bad busy? Right. It's a shorthand. Yeah.
that's great. I think that's an awesome way to open up the conversation to more than just, oh, so busy, because I think
Yep.
it's also like a little bit of a conversation ender at times.
Right.
All right, so we talked about the busy dashboard KPI, but what else would you add?
Yeah, so there's a few KPIs. I'll kind of run through a few that I think are good high level numbers. Like, whenever I'm starting to work with an organization, these are the things that I'll start with. Like, the first one is a bit of a process piece, which is SLAs. And the first conversation that I'll have is like, do you have SLAs? Well, no, or maybe yes, but okay, we need to start implementing them and measuring them. And owners get a little nervous. They're like, but I haven't committed anything to the clients. I haven't told them. I'm like, that's fine. Like, we're not talking about SLAs for clients. We're understanding sort of a lean production methodology of a ticket life cycle. So how long does it take from the opening of a ticket to the resolution and the close of a ticket, and what's the life cycle in between? So I'm a big fan of lean methodology. It's based on sort of factory floors, but you can apply it to in the same way of treating you're producing a car in a manufacturing firm versus you're producing a ticket, and what's the life cycle and how does it work out? So SLA is an excellent way to measure that and understand it. And often what I'll find is I'll meet with people and we'll review some data, we'll do a bit of cleaning up, and I'll tell them, all right, on average, it takes you 16 hours to close a ticket. And they're just like, like, no, no, that's not true. That can't be true. Like, no, that's like, we're much better than this, right? It's like, okay, sure. I'm not saying you're lying, but I'm telling you the system is not lying either. So what this often means is that there's process issues of how that ticket moves through this life cycle. And this is a really effective way to leverage a KPI to make changes, reverse engineer the process, apply different approaches to how you're treating the ticket through this life cycle, then measure it with the production output of that KPI and start to drive those numbers down. So that's a broad one to really start with that I think is useful. So that goes to the first two numbers that are pretty important that I usually put on KPI dashboards, which is average time to acknowledgement and average time to resolution. Res plan is one that people will see. It's not terribly important. It's an interesting metric, but not super important.
Yeah.
Acknowledgement and
Not
resolution.
everything needs triage. Not everything needs sort of a big plan. You just get, want to get from point A to point B.
Yeah. So that the acknowledgement of the ticket is crucial, right? Because this is a trust-based business, and how long it takes from I have submitted a ticket to how long I've heard from someone is a high standard of measure of whether or not the clients trust you. And for the smaller MSPs, you're potentially at risk here if you have these clients where you do regular on-sites and everyone's holding their tickets and the tech shows up and they just mob them with like, oh, he's here. Yay. I've got all these tickets for you. Right. Like they probably don't trust that things are being entered and being managed on the service desk. So those are really important measures. Resolution, pretty obvious. Like how long does it take for you to actually close these issues? And that's important both from a client perception standpoint, but also from the efficiency of the staff, because you can think about it. If it takes on average 4 hours to close a ticket, 2 tickets a day, what's your production volume from your staff versus 30 minutes to 45 minutes to close a ticket? Volumes go way up and you're able to handle a lot more input through the service desk.
So right there is like a first really great objective measure for the client's subjective feeling of happiness and being taken care of. You've probably seen a ton of data. Do you find that there is a very direct correlation between that first response or acknowledgement to, CSAT scores, for example?
100%. Yeah. It's the acknowledgement is really key. I think the lifecycle management of that ticket is also really key, because there's a very broad difference between ticket is opened on a Monday morning, ticket gets closed Tuesday afternoon, or better yet, Wednesday morning, versus ticket is opened on Monday. Someone calls them and says, hey, got your ticket. We're going to start working on this. You can expect to hear from someone by this afternoon. Does that work? Yep, that's fine. And then that doesn't happen. Someone calls them and says, hey, so sorry, like we're going to have to shift this ticket to tomorrow morning. Is that an issue for you? Not great, but sure, fine, whatever. And then they work on that ticket and resolve it. That is far better than tickets opened, ticket gets closed like 2 days later and you send an email
until Wednesday.
Yeah. So like clients hate it when tickets are lost in a vacuum, right? And you'll see, like, I have this service pyramid that I sort of describe to people, and service is at the base of that pyramid, because you can't go to a strategic meeting with a client leveraging tools like Lifecycle Insights to do your QBR and try to talk about strategic objectives, projects, cybersecurity, when all they're focused on is that ticket they opened 2 weeks ago and have not heard anything about. That's really frustrating and derails all strategic conversations.
So I think it's no secret that MSPs definitely, I mean, there's always an ebb and flow to things. I mean, I feel like we need an objective measure for the subjective full moon scenario of like, what's going on? There's a full moon. Why are we getting so many tickets today? And there are weeks, you and I have both seen this at Fully Managed, where there just stuff goes nuts and there doesn't seem to be a rhyme or reason to it. But that kind of sort of segues to the next question, which is how do you effectively balance workload in the service desk? And I asked this question with one caveat. It's not until about the 8 or 10 person MSP that you typically see that they can hire a service desk manager and start to properly sort of manage a bit of this process and the triage. What are the sub 10 people MSPs to do in this scenario? What are some techniques you've seen if you lack a service desk manager? Or is it really just stop complaining and hire a service desk manager?
I don't think it's a requirement. By all means, it is not necessarily a role. It's a hat that someone has to wear, and quite often the owner has these 8 hats stacked on top that they're wearing. The service manager is one of them. Like, you can delegate that hat to someone else and still have them do a player coach role where they're doing some of this. It's a 20% carve out on what they're otherwise doing in an 8-hour day, where you're committing some time for administrative overhead to help them kind of do some traffic copying, help with escalations, do some service reviews and some reporting. So it doesn't necessarily need to be a role, but it also doesn't need to exist exclusively for the owner to do in addition to all the 8 other things that they're responsible for in a day. But as far to your question, I think one of the biggest things that I would recommend, and this is something that MSPs, large and small, are victims of, is that they're not terribly good at leaning out the work that they're responsible for. And if you have no priorities, everything is a priority. What this often looks like is, I'll show up, do a bit of an assessment of an IT environment. I'll start looking at their tickets, and I'm like, okay, so you have 20,000 alerts on your alert tickets on your alert board. Like, what are we doing here? Like, has anyone touched these? Like, oh, no. We just go in there every once in a while and close all of
Select
them.
all, yeah,
Like,
yeah.
yeah, like, well, why does it exist in the first place? And the bizarre response that I get from people is, well, we might miss something if we don't monitor it. And I'm like,
Well, yeah, you're
I
missing everything at
guarantee
this
you,
point.
you're
Yeah.
missing something in the noise here, right? So that I think for efficiency standpoint is it's amazing how much more you can get done if you focus on less, right? And that's what I would really encourage people to do is don't take everything that you do for face value and evaluate it and say, who does this produce value for, right? And I don't know if this is a broad term, but in one of my clients, we have this term we call the scream test, where basically you stop doing something or you unplug it and you see if anyone complains, right? And I would encourage a lot of organizations to take a look at some of the workload that you're managing and question whether or not it produces any value. Stop doing it and see if anybody complains, right?
Yeah, I think we've all done this with the occasional Windows XP white box that's sitting in the server room. Is like, what is this running? What is it doing? And it's just unplug it and
Yep.
find out. Somebody's gonna send a ticket in. Hopefully not through the alert board at this point, however,
Right.
because you'll miss it. But wow, yeah.
And so just to more broadly on this, like the tactical application, like at a small MSP, you're not necessarily going to have a tiered based structure. At a larger MSP, you probably should. We won't necessarily get into pod structures. It's like another sort of lengthy discussion to get into. But I think you definitely want to think about democratizing down the information available to tier one staff, because it's easier to hire tier ones. It's cheaper to hire tier ones. It gives them a career path to move up in if they're a tier one. And quite frankly, they come with less bad habits than the tier twos or the tier threes that you may be hiring. So if you focus on good documentation, strong standardization, like if you take anything away from this discussion, standardization is your strongest lever to be able to pull as an MSP. The more you can standardize, the more predictable those environments are. That will dramatically increase your efficiency by reducing the complexity of what you support. So then it's easier for those tier ones to just sort of pick up the work and drive that stuff out of the system, rather than everything coming through and be like, I don't know, I'll Google around for 45 minutes before I escalate it to the tier two guy who's completely flooded and everything's being escalated to him. And, now that becomes a bottleneck, right?
So true. Um, the standardization is one that I think is starting to. There's some interesting opinions about it, because just this last week I heard this idea that if all you're trying to do is push your tech stack down to your customer, I think there's a happy medium, by the way, to what I'm going to say. If all you're doing is pushing your tech stack down to the customer, you miss the opportunities to adapt technology to serve business outcomes, and potentially hamstring the customer to some extent. If all you're doing is pushing the agenda of your tech stack, you still have to be able to remain focused on driving their business outcomes through that technology stack, of course. But it's about focusing on the customer and their business outcomes, and not necessarily on the stack. And so I think it's kind of an internal exercise, but a lot of MSPs externalize the exercise to their customers, and they start talk about the importance of standardization, and to the customer, like, what do they care if you're more efficient? All that means to them is that you're spending less time supporting them, and to them that means they should pay less. And so,
Yeah.
like, it could be counterproductive, is my point, but I think it just gets you off the target, which is really to talk about their business outcomes. But your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you're right. Like, hey, we don't like Dropbox. We only support OneDrive, so we're going to rip out Dropbox and put in OneDrive. And
Mm.
like, yeah, if you don't train the staff around using that, everyone's going to hate it and they'll be less efficient and say, well, this was a terrible change. Like, why did they decide to do this? Right. So, understanding the business and context and why they're doing something and making sure that you're always thinking about the user experience, I think is really crucial, especially when it comes to kind of putting on that business analyst hat and understanding what is their workflow, what do they work on, what's important, what shouldn't we touch, or at least what should we question changing. But I think a lot of this, like what I'm more talking about is like, do they care what type of firewall you use or that they have? Probably not. Like, what's the practical implication that they'll have around that? Again, like backup
Mm.
systems or AV, like none of this really matters to most businesses. The exception would be once you get into a co-managed model where there's potentially an internal IT director, there's shared responsibility for, the devices and the infrastructure with an internal team, then it gets a little gray. But if you're an MSP supporting 20 to 50 staff, accountant and logistics firms and medical offices, they don't care about technology. They don't understand it. That's why you're in the room to begin with. So being prescriptive, I think, is really beneficial for everybody, provided you're not sort of saying, hey, we should do this instead. You do a bunch of changes to their infrastructure and then like, oh, sorry, I just squished one of your line of business applications and it doesn't work in this environment.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was probably a bad plan, right? Yeah.
Mm. All right, so 30 minutes in, we're into question number two. We're gonna have to
I knew this was going to be a problem.
we're gonna try and light the fire here.
Okay.
So talking about bottlenecks, I think this is an interesting
Yeah.
one because I think we're a lot of us as MSPs have gotten in our own way in many respects as we try to do some of these things. But what are some of the common bottlenecks you see with the service desk operations?
Yeah, so I think the biggest one, like again, calls back to just doing too much, right? Like it's pretty difficult to address 1,000 tickets. But if you chop that in half, then 500 is maybe easier to tackle. So what are like if you're producing a backlog of tickets, then that you need to understand, do we need to hire more staff? Is that practical, or do we need to refocus what we're actually prioritizing and what we work on? So slimming down the incoming workload is your best bet on limiting those bottlenecks. And then using sort of this process mapping, there's again a lean process to discover sort of the life cycle of any process or activity that you're doing inside an organization. And this can be really it's called value stream mapping, and this can be really valuable in sort of short form to just sort of figure this out. What I described around using the SLA is sort of a short form of doing that, but this can be helpful where you're like, okay, this part of the process takes about 10 minutes, this takes 30, and then all of a sudden we have this variance where sometimes it's 5 minutes and other times it's 5 hours. Like, what is that? What happens here? And being able to understand what impacts that process to slow things down is helpful. And what often you find is like, there's a great book, if anyone hasn't read it, please add this to your Audible or your Amazon list, is The Phoenix Project. Um,
Mm.
and whenever people have read this book, I often we can have this shorthand discussion of the Brent problem, and they describe this guy in the organization that everyone has seen in their IT company or has in their IT company, and he's a Brent, where everything ends up on Brent's plate because he's very capable and understands everything, but no, he ends up being this bottleneck where like, not sure what to do with this. I guess we'll have to escalate it to Brent. And eventually, like Brent either burns out or he's just incapable of addressing the workload that comes through. So in a lot of cases, it's sometimes a process issue, but in most cases, I would say it's usually a personnel and process issue where you're just ballooning tickets and not able to drain the sink effectively, right?
So tell me what happens, just to get into maybe the double click of the value stream mapping for just a sec. You mentioned sort of, hey, this part takes 10 minutes, this part takes 5, and then you have this part C where there's this tremendous variance. Like, what would the value stream mapping process typically achieve here? Is it sort of separating that variance out from the typical process? Like, this is an escalation point type of thing. This is where you triage. Like, what is the typical thing you want to review in that variance?
Yeah, I think it's you're assuming again, kind of like the subjective experiences is like, why do tickets take 8 hours to close? Like I don't know, like it feels like most of them are an hour, sometimes 30 minutes. Like what's happening here? So you have this macro view, and the process map helps you to dial in like where to focus the energy. Because we don't need to reinvent the entire workflow
Process. Yeah.
of the ticket lifecycle itself. We need to understand escalations, right? Like why does stuff go to tier two? Do they not have documentation? Do they not understand or have the training around enough of the systems to be able to resolve these on their own? Do these things take a long time because like we don't have enough tier twos, right? Like it's understanding where that problem exists, and therefore what's the part that you should focus on resolving as a part of that. So it just helps you dial in on, if we're not going to spend 2 days trying to figure this out, let's just spend 2 hours trying to figure out what is the broken part of this process and flip that out, or refine it to make it more efficient, right?
Mm, love that. Um, okay. So we've seen this already, and there's companies like Pia, there's companies like Roost that are doing process automation, and so there was a sort of this big leaning into process automation, RPA, and some of that stuff, and now AI is popping up obviously everywhere. Are you seeing any like real AI being deployed inside a service desk at this point, or not yet? It's just still a little bit buzzwordy.
I would say so. My prediction on this, I sent in an email and I got a lot of sort of contrary feedback on this, but my prediction is 1 to 3 years. So we're a year into this from when I first talked about this. 1 to 3 years is experimentation phase. 3 to 5 years is where it shows up, it's practical, and it has real life sort of day-to-day implications. And then that 5 to 10 is where it dramatically impacts how the business of the IT service desk actually works, right? A
Yeah.
lot of people sort of poo-pooed that and said, no, 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 it's already here. Like it's going to change things next year. I'm like, yeah, well, we'll see. We'll see how long it takes for these things to roll out. But there are some very practical experiments that I've seen lately. So, even a bit of a throwback, like Crushbank, for example, has been around for a long time,
Yeah.
using Big Blue and IBM machines to ingest your ticket data and try to find patterns, and then look for those patterns in the future, provide sort of shortcuts for examples. And then there's others like Thread is a good example of people that are using, it reads your ticket notes and then provides a summarization and potentially even tells you how much time you spent on a ticket. So like the back ending of this data I think is really helpful, where it can just alleviate some of the admin overhead for
Mm.
the work that the service desk is doing. So I think that's the most practical application of where this starts to show up. Is there's a lot of sort of like boxes we need to click and fields to fill out and forms to do, that I think a lot of this can be short circuited. Areas like documentation, RPA, all of those things I think will be really valuable here. And there's some great experiments happening. I'll give you sort of my broader vision on what this looks like, and maybe a sort of a longer term call to arms for MSPs. I've been encouraging for years a lot of people to take outsourcing of their service desk a little more seriously. And this is great because it gives you this elastic capability on adding or reducing resources based on what you need. But I still feel a lot of the business that we do is local, right? Project delivery, deployments, the AM and account management, VCIO strategy with the client, all of that stuff will always be local, I think, for the very long
Sure.
term future of the IT service delivery. But I think there's very much a realistic view in that through sort of end of that 3 to 5 and the 5 to 10, where this really starts to change, where the new generation of users are much more comfortable to use chatbots than the older guard. And we'll have this new generation of users that will engage with a chatbot. Chatbot deeply understands what they're actually trying to achieve, can look at previous ticket data, and actually either run scripts or suggest KBs that the client could self-serve to fix their own issue. So this requires both the technical capability for this to happen, but also that cultural adaptation for people being comfortable enough to actually engage with it. But I think this will have a dramatic effect on what the size and scope of work looks like for a lot of internal service desks.
And I'll admit this. I think certainly sometimes it's about the quality of life improvements, and I'll give you an example that is even more practical at really the ground level of all of this, which is and I've seen Zendesk already do this. Intercom has already done this. And so because as a vendor, we spend a lot of time in the enterprise service desk apps, we kind of see a different viewpoint of it. But Zendesk already has AI in their interface to help you turn a broken English, bullet pointed response to a ticket into a glorious, well-written thing that is intelligible and, easy to interact with. And I'd love to see some of the MSP tools at least do that, because, Lord knows that spending so much time writing out a beautiful sentence is sometimes just people see no value. The technicians see no value in doing that.
Yep.
But this is also the image of your business, how the clients expect you to interact. And sometimes it makes a difference to at least have, well-constructed sentences. So I see this as an easy win to just create a lifestyle improvement there potentially. But
Yep.
so I think you're right. 3 to 5 years, we'll see the proper execution of these strategies now that everybody has tried the different things. And, and ChatGPT is not everything that's out there. And so I think people have to spend some time seeing what other models are interesting and doing a better job at taking interesting information and turning it into something else, for sure.
Yeah. Just one
Uh,
other point on this,
mm,
because like I get a lot of people that ask me like, "Hey, do you have an SOP or a process for this?" And I'm like, "Well, yeah, I mean, I've got like some skeletons for you to use, some templates, but people over leverage on process." And what I like, so I have an IT documentation course, and one of the common points of feedback I get about the course is like, I was hoping for more SOPs. And the response that I haven't built into the course, but I will absolutely do this soon, is like, if you want SOPs, just go to ChatGPT and ask for a very specific process. I've tested this, and its ability to spit out at least a baseline SOP that's like 70% complete is really good, right? Like whatever you need that process to be, you're gonna have to put a little muscle, elbow grease into building it yourself. But getting past blank page syndrome,
yeah,
I
the
think
writer's block.
is one of the most effective things that I've used ChatGPT for. Is just like, where do I start with this? Hey, ChatGPT, how do we do this? And then like all of a sudden the floodgates open. You're like, that's not what I'm going to use, but perfect. And I'm going to take the first sentence and run with it, basically.
That's awesome. And that's kind of the way that I use it as well. I just sort of overcome the writer's block with it. I just even like the list of questions for this thing. I threw, hey, I'm interviewing an expert on service desk efficiency and project management for MSPs. Give me 10 compelling questions to ask him, 5 each. And so then you go and tweak it to the things that I know about you and the way that you've done work and stuff like that. So it's super powerful when used right. And I think the combination of human plus AI is actually what's going to drive a lot of the future in this space. All right, so let's get into project management, because I think there's a whole other can of worms to open
Yep.
there. This is a key aspect of all MSPs in their revenue generation capabilities. Even from the day one that you sign on a new client, you're typically engaging in some kind of remediation project. You want to deliver that a top-notch service and KPIs and metrics and everything else, because you're setting the stage for how you're going to be providing service to that customer. So you can either go out like with a bang or just go incredibly wrong. I don't know that a lot of people speak about MSP project management in terms of these methodologies like agile
Mhm.
or waterfall. But tell me, because that's just in a software terminology. But tell me a little bit about your experience and which of these methodologies best seems to work for MSPs, and what does it mean?
Okay, so agile process is basically an iterative, constantly evolving project process. So you think of this sort of like as the circle of life around projects, like assess, plan, execute, review,
Continuous
assess,
improvement. Yeah.
plan. Yeah, and you constantly go through this cycle. That's not a terribly great approach for project delivery in MSPs, I would say, and IT in general, unless you're doing software. Like software is very much an iterative process, but most of the work that we're doing, you have an end in mind. Like we want to replace this phone system. We want to move this workload to the cloud. You understand at least what you're trying to deliver on. If not, do an assessment first. Like I think one thing I would say on paid for projects is having a client pay for an assessment where it's warranted is actually really, really valuable to have a tighter SOW and be able to effectively sell fixed fee projects, which is how you create the margin in projects. Because otherwise, you're coming from a high leverage MSP model and sort of like devaluing yourself into a T&M model in projects, right? So if you want margins in your projects to be really effective, then you want to look at selling those fixed fees and looking for the efficiency that you can gain in those processes. All right, so a bit off track.
Well, but I
Waterfall.
love that
Yep.
because the comment you made about devaluing yourself with a TNM model, there's so much to uncover there because like, billing by the hour penalizes being good. For example, you've heard all these expressions around the TNM model that I think are so true. But it's the first time I hear it said like that, devaluing yourself with the TNM model. Can you expand?
Yeah, like the beauty of the MSP model from like why we've sort of ended up here and evolved sort of this business process around this is that it's a very high leverage model and it has aligned interests as well, right? So you mentioned the IT man's dilemma of everything is broken around here, what do I pay you for? And then you get in there, do some projects, straighten everything out, whip up the environment, and then it runs like a charm, and then you're
What
met
do I
with,
pay you
well,
for? Yeah.
yeah, like everything works. I never call you, what do I pay you for, right? So but that's like that is a beauty of the model because you want to get away from why I say leverage is the TNM model suffers from having no leverage in that if you want to make more money, you have to trade someone's hours for that, right? And if you're scaling a business, luckily it's not your hours necessarily. You want to hire people and have them do that work, but it's still a 1-to-1 ratio of how much money you can generate and how much profit you can generate. Whereas with an MSP model, you can increase the revenue and increase the margin at the same time because you're finding efficiency in the model where you're able to leverage outcomes for the client rather than sort of the inputs, right? So the outputs rather than the inputs of I did work. Some of this is psychological, getting clients away from this idea of if I see you here, like I want you doing regular client on site so that I feel like you're busy and you do something for us. When it helps, again, coming back to this idea of the service desk model is not really where you're going to differentiate. It is highly commoditized. It will be increasingly commoditized into the future. So the area you want to build your business on is that relationship and understanding that client's business and be able to deliver value and feel like you're a partner, not a vendor. So that helps you to build a much tighter relationship with that person where there's going to be high value. They treat you as a part of the business rather than just, we'll call those guys when something's broken. So that's really, really important for the MSP model.
I think where we come from though still creates a little bit of a rift there because I probably see more often than not that the average MSP under a certain size, I will qualify, has kind of moved to the recurring billing model, fixed monthly fee, but then they kind of mix it with the TNM model for break fix projects or little things here and there. And so I feel like there is that contentious sort of dynamic of we're doing this all-inclusive thing here, but we're doing this TNM thing here. And I don't know if it's because it's just tedious and time-consuming to quote fixed fee projects, or people just don't know how to articulate the value of a fixed fee project when in the client's mind that's only going to take 30 minutes. That's a typical example of the thing that sort of makes MSPs relent and go to like, well, we'll just charge you for the visit, and our truck roll time or what have you. So like, what is the solution there to move into fixed fee project quoting and charging for value? Because I feel like there's a conversation aspect that a lot of people haven't been able to tap into.
Yeah, so there's a lot here, right? I think one of the most important pieces is being diligent about your scoping process. And like I said, like if the scoping process is gnarly enough that you're not sure what it's going to look like and you're kind of throwing darts about how much you think it's going to cost, doing that the first time is incredibly dangerous. Like, yes, if it's a totally unique project,
Yeah,
then
you
maybe
might
you
get
are doing it
fleeced.
as TNM, right? Yeah, like I've never done this before. Hey, I'm happy to do this for you as a third party, but like I don't have a lot of expertise. I'm smarter than you, so around this IT thing. So let me help you. But the other side is like if you're doing like a server upgrade or swapping out someone's Wi-Fi equipment, like how to do this. You know how long it's going to take, right? So I have these tools that I've built up that you've seen, Luis, that we've used in the past where
Yeah.
it becomes your bill of materials, your BOM is a menu where you pick through and you have standardized times around how long something takes in your business from a project's perspective. And this is a golden unlock for being able to properly scope business, because the thing that's beautiful about this is the more times you do it, the tighter the scoping gets on what you're actually scoping for that client. Because you do a project review, so kickoff, communication, process, execution, and close are really, really important for your project process. The close gets skipped over a lot. And what it helps to feed back is, we keep scoping this bit of work for 8 hours, and consistently it takes us 12 to 15. So maybe we should up the quoting level on this piece of work to 12 or 14 just to capture that, right? So that's how you get more efficient and properly scope things as you go. So that's a really, really important aspect of this. And I think the other part is, again, the project process and people having good project fundamentals in their business is in IT space is not common, unfortunately. I've had people literally tell me that it's an ends to a means just to get things done so they'll continue to renew the MSA. Like they're not even looking to make money on projects. They just know they have to do it for various reasons in their business. So that's a lot of where I think where that mentality comes from is like, we'll just do this and get this done because we're strapped for time. How do I get resources? I'm borrowing people from the service desk. Like it just feels so chaotic, right? And that's the part you need to button down with some good process. And then it really sings and resonates and works better.
So let me argue with you for just a minute because it's fun. Uh, you just said, take the inputs of like how long it typically takes and then just kind of make it a flat fee. But I think the challenge is that you're still kind of relying on this consumption of cost of goods, which is that hour that sits on the shelf of every project delivery technician or professional you have in your business. But is there a world where we can properly scope this based on the value the customer is receiving? And I guess the question mark, because can you realistically go in and say, okay, well, Mr. Customer, Mrs. Customer, this project is going to help you increase your revenue by 8x. Our fee for this project is 10% of that increase in revenue. Like I've seen engineers do this with, go into a hotel, offer to replace all the shower heads for free, and then come and charge a percentage of what they saved in water the next quarter. And so, like, I don't know, I feel like there's still this contentious issue of everything we want to bill is fixed fee, but all the inputs to it are still hourly. So I don't know.
Yeah, I like the model. I think it requires a level of sophistication that is not common in most of the IT service organizations, unfortunately. Like if you get to a space where you're able to predictably deliver in a very tight delivery model, you're making lots of money on projects and it's very reliable. And I think those are the things that you could start to lean into and experiment with for sure, like almost a shared revenue model or a shared return model. I've seen one or two very large organizations test this, and in some cases it is a dramatically outsized return. But every once in a while, they'll get absolutely torched by this, right? Where you're basically burning 3 months of effort and get zero return for it. So
Yeah.
it's like it's great, it's high leverage, but it's not without risks. And I think for most organizations, like if they can't even figure out what the costs are ahead of time for a 3-week project, they're not going to be terribly great at figuring out a shared return
Yeah.
model, right?
So I think what you've just said is you're either trading risk for a lower profit margin
Yeah.
potentially and having to keep some of those margins and overhead a little bit tighter for the sake of the relationship in these
Yeah.
cases, or the client is also wildly interested in, hey, if we're saving $1 million, I don't mind giving you 100K. And so you just have to, I guess, find those opportunities. But the sophistication of being able to tell when to do that, I guess, is really the key. All
Yeah,
right,
because
next.
like just really quickly, because like you said, like the T&M model is done for a predictability of revenue, right? And the if you sort of apply that same principle to the fixed fee model, there's a lot of people that do lose their shirt on a fixed fee model too, where something goes completely wrong, and like you've burned your gross margin and maybe are underwater on that project. That's sort of the risk, and I think that's one of the selling element to the client is like, look, this is how much you're going to pay, sort of hell or high water. If things go really wrong or we don't have a good change management process, we own that, right? And so there is some risk in doing that fixed fee model, and that's why people are a little leery of it, is they don't want to be wearing the costs for some of those changes in the project that impact them and impact the cost, because the client is not on the hook to pay for those necessarily, right?
Yeah. Well, ironically, I think you have a situation there too, where if you don't have the right project KPIs, you're not understanding, how the project is going at certain key milestones milestones of the scope, then you might find out too late that you're losing your shirt on that project. And again, there's a lot of things that are at play here, whether it's the project engineer's pride of not wanting to say, this is going sideways, and I'm
Yeah.
going to try and do this and fix it on my own without alerting anybody. And then, then you're hours and hours and hours in. They're burnt out. You can't recover the time. It all just goes sideways, of course, from
Yep.
there. But I think there's a common thing to this next question of ensuring project management processes align with service delivery goals. I've seen MSPs say, yeah, you pay us a flat fee and that includes all our projects that we do for you to maintain your environment. And then I see them consequently have 6-month wait times to get them into the project queue because, they're just so busy. And so your service desk might be doing a great job, but your project team is absolutely shitting the proverbial bed. And so then there's the other aspect of it, which you tend to start relationships with clients in a project delivery situation. You're doing onboarding, you're doing a remediation thing. And then I think a lot of promises are made in that short amount of time. And then you're handing off to the service desk team to kind of maintain the relationship. And I feel that handoff process has sort of the opportunity to be a complete black hole where a lot of things are missed. But it's kind of incumbent on the service delivery team to be like, hey, you are, or here's the thing we're delivering, and then the service desk has to approve that this customer is ready for ongoing support. But what have you seen in that realm that is sort of an interesting thing to tweak?
Yeah, so a few things. Number one is having the service team and especially the projects team having some visibility to the sales funnel is really valuable here, so that they understand what's on deck. What are the projects that we're going to work on? There's both the psychological aspect of like, I know this is a problem, I wish someone would address it, and then it shows up in the project funnel, and they're like, oh, cool, okay, well, someone's paying attention, right? So that's really helpful. The one you kind of noted is that I think is really, really important here is the project handoff. And it is one of the cardinal sins of IT organizations is the handoff either doesn't exist or is really poor. And it's understandable why this happens, unfortunately, because again, like blame busy, everyone always has something else to move on to. And you get to the end of this project and you're just desperately looking at everything else you have to do and want to move on to the next thing. But it's super, super important to be able to do an appropriate handoff with the service desk and say, this is the project for client A that we did. These are the things that were changed. We decommed these 4 systems. I have updated the documentation. Very, very important. And if you guys have any sort of impacts over the next couple of days, this is the key contact to get a hold of in the projects team, whether it's me or this other person. So it's amazing how much this type of handoff doesn't have to be lengthy, right? At FM, we did this in our stand-up, where a project person would come do a 5-minute report on projects that are being completed and what the expectations and outcomes of that were. And it just went a long way to kind of greasing the wheels of communication and collaboration between the groups. Because otherwise, you're often left in the situation where there's unintentional consequences, there's fallout that happens from a project, and the service team resents the projects team of like, oh, these guys just go in there, they break a bunch of stuff, don't tell anybody, and then they move on and they're not responsible for it, and we have to clean up the mess. Like, you can understand why that sentiment creeps in, but it is incredibly damaging to your team culture. So it's just this simple handoff that you have to do and make sure that you're diligent about not closing the projects until, for example, like if you have a service manager or a pod manager, that there's a handoff to that pod manager or the service manager where they at least validate the documentation has been updated. And then they tell the project coordinator, the project manager, like, yep, okay, it's good. I'll accept the close of this project. So you're not just sort of like, oh, yeah, I updated the project documentation. And then someone goes in there.
There's nothing there.
Yeah, and I've seen this where people are, trying to support a server. They're like, "Oh, I think this thing is offline. I don't understand where it went. Something's happening here." 2 hours later, someone's like, "Oh yeah, we decommed that on the weekend." Like, nice. Would have been good to tell me about that before I burned 2 hours looking for the thing.
Yeah,
right?
or at least silence the alerts from the RMM, right? Oh my God, there's so many things there that's I think a whole comedy show of bad things that go wrong. Okay, time for one more question, and I want to ask this last question because I think it's an interesting one. In the context of cybersecurity, I feel like every little project introduces risk potentially into an environment, and I feel like not enough project teams or service teams are looking at the project delivery from the risk management perspective. And we could be doing a lot better there. Hey, this is VCIO. Did you talk about the risk that this project introduces, and try to reverse the roles so that when the VCOs are having conversations with customers about projects, that the risk is already documented and well known, and these are the things that are being documented, and so on, as opposed to having to have sort of the recovery conversation on the flip side of the coin. But tell me about your experience with the best practices here. Where can MSPs best sort of deal with some of this risk in their project management process?
Yeah, so risk is really crucial in project management. I don't think people put enough practical thought around this when they're spinning up a project. And there's both technical risk as well as sort of risk to the project health and efficiency. So, for example, like I've seen projects get spun up in a co-managed environment, and they're supposed to kick off the week that like the IT manager is on vacation. And like you guys, like no one looked at this. Like we can't, of course, we can't start this project because this person is gone for 2 weeks. Like, what do we do with this? So we don't like. There's not enough internal documentation for us to get started. The things that we needed, the clearances from third parties are not here, right? So there's practical risks, I think, that often are overlooked about how are we actually going to do this. You're right. Like changes to the environment and projects in particular are incredibly risky in this aspect, right? So good examples, I've seen one event where tech went into a system, was making some changes, and they had this process where they would disable a certain security measure while they cloned a service, like reset up some things, and then they were supposed to re-enable that service. They didn't re-enable that service, it got skipped, and the entire sort of portion of that infrastructure got ransomed. And luckily, they had basically sort of like logical air-gapped backups. So the impact was, just a late night of recovery for most of these systems. But that's the type of thing that you need to be super, super diligent about. Is
the change control. Yeah.
Exactly. And another one is, simple stuff of like in a troubleshooting process, I was trying to install this new system. I opened a few ports on the firewall for testing and forgot to close them, right? Yeah. Those types of things are incredibly dangerous. And again, I think this comes back to that project close of like, if you're messing with a firewall or you're changing or installing systems, like what is your backup plan, right? Like you don't need a formal CAB, like a change advisory board, like that exists in enterprise organizations, and some MSPs I know actively use them, but you at least need some type of rollback plan to be a part of that, or a recovery plan if things go completely sideways. Like if you're installing a new system, or especially like when you're onboarding, like don't make any changes until you've validated the fact that the backup lives, right? Like not that they have backups, but that they're recoverable, right?
Yeah,
I've seen
yeah.
this
Otherwise, they're
numerous
nothing.
times.
Yeah, they're
Yeah,
useless.
yeah.
Otherwise, yeah.
Like, oh, they have backups, no problem. You make some changes, like, oh, let's go to the shit, right?
Yeah, those are the sort of I told you so moments that I think we keep on talking about. My gosh, Todd, there's definitely going to have to be a part two. I feel like there's so many little things to dig into that we could have kept going for a while. But thanks everybody for joining us. Todd, thank you so much. As we usually do, we'll send a note on Monday or Tuesday with a link to the recording for this, and we'll let you know about next week's guest. Who I don't have the list in front of me right this second, so I forget, but I'll announce it in the email next week. And just remember, we'll be moving this Zoom call to Wednesdays over the next little bit. Thanks, everybody. Todd, thanks once again. And everybody have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, Luis.
Cheers.
See ya.